Charles, man, thanks so much for coming on the show here today. Really excited to have you on. Could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And Mike, first of all, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here today, and hopefully the listener gets some good value out of the show today. So, yeah, my name's Charles Ashford. I'm a performance nutritionist by trade. As you may be able to tell, I'm not originally from the States. I moved over here from the UK right around 10 years ago now. So, yeah, to be able to say I've been here for a decade is it's kind of neat. And, currently working as a performance nutritionist with the Dallas Mavericks and the NBA, coming up on my fourth season with them, and a couple of stops prior in the collegiate ranks. Spent some time at Texas Tech, followed by the University of North Texas, kind of leading up to my current role.
Okay, very cool, very cool. And talk to me, what got you into the world of physical preparation? I'd love to know what people's backgrounds are and what kind of pushed them into this world.
Yeah, probably a pretty similar answer to what I imagine you get from a lot of your guests, right? Love sport growing up, love playing sport, but was never gonna kind of cut the top ranks in any of the sports that I played. Could always hold my own and was, skillful enough to be, let's say, sufficient in several sports, but wasn't gonna make it to the professional ranks. So,
yep.
I really wanted to find a way to be involved. And I actually initially wanted to be a coach. Coming from the UK, obviously soccer is a religion over there. I wanted to be a soccer coach, but I wanted to kind of add that sports science element of it too. I enjoyed science in school and growing up. And so my initial degree route was sports coaching and sports science, so a little bit more focused on coaching concepts. We can get into this later. I think it's actually maybe served me well later in my career. When we look at coaching, behavior change, a lot of these things which are kind of really entrenched in nutrition practice.
Sure.
But as the degree program went on, kind of got exposed to a little bit more physical training myself. I was still playing soccer to my time at university. I just became fascinated by the exercise physiology component of the program and the role of nutrition in physical performance, and how, nutrition is one of the few things that the athlete, really does control themselves, and the impact it could have on performance, on physical changes, on your body composition, also just on your mood and the way that you feel. It kind of really flipped the script for me. And my personal advisor was pretty heavily involved in that space at the university. We were able to make some changes to the degree path and the kind of route that I was on. From there, kind of transitioned, into the sports nutrition space. So yeah, that's kind of really how I fell into the space, honestly.
Yeah. Okay, so I have somewhat serious question for you. You've already used the term soccer twice. Are you just doing that for us Americans? Because I'm sure does it feel weird calling it soccer and not football?
I feel like I've got pretty good at being able to flip my terminology depending on who I'm speaking to.
Yes.
Quite quickly, whenever I go home and I'm around my friends, instantly I sense the change and the awareness of being able to make sure that I don't say something and they're going to look at me sideways for being Americanized.
Oh my gosh, yeah. No, it's just funny because whenever I have people from England and Australia, generally they'll talk about football. I know what they're talking about, but not always everybody does. 'Cause I just spend enough time in the space, but it's just interesting to hear you use that term. So I figure you just figured how to flip that switch whenever you needed to.
100%, just playing up to the audience.
I love it, man. Okay, so last but not least, you decide you're going to shift gears. You're going to focus more on nutrition. You've already talked about this a little bit, but I would love to hear your career path. So once you're done with school, what are some of the stops along the way, and how do you ultimately end up with the Dallas Mavericks?
Yeah, I spent a summer in the US upon graduating, my undergraduate degree, and I actually spent a lot of time in the US with my dad growing up. Did a lot of business in the Carolinas, and so I was constantly in and out of school. If he was going, I was going with him.
That's cool.
Getting to spend that time with him out here. And I'd always had a desire to live and work in the US one day. And I got home that summer. I was about to move to Leeds Beckett University to do a master's degree in sports nutrition. And, I just decided to get a feel for what was out there. So I was applying for, probably jobs I had no business applying for, and reaching out to different colleges and teams. And Texas Tech University got back to me. And over the course of the summer, we had some conversations. And it ultimately led to, if you want to come out here for a year, we'll take you on an internship. It's unpaid. There's no promises what comes of it. But, if you want to do it, let's go. So, kind of took the jump, got a visa, pulled the plug on the masters about a week before I needed to be there. And I moved to Lubbock, Texas.
Wow. Okay.
Bit of a culture shock.
Yeah.
But it was a fantastic time for me. I spent 3 years at Texas Tech. After my first year there, they created a full-time role and position for me. I was working pretty closely with the football team, kind of during the Cliff Kingsbury, Pat Mahomes era. Had a really great experience there. And the goal was initially to always go back home. But as time went on, I wanted to kind of explore, what a future in the US could look like, and was fortunate to get a position at the University of North Texas. They'd never had a sports nutrition program before. They had just got a new athletic director. It was an opportunity to come in and build from complete scratch. When I say complete scratch, I'm talking no budget, no office, no facility, nothing. And I think as a practitioner, it was an amazing opportunity for me because I had to learn how to function and be effective with no resources. I come from a program which was pretty well resourced, and if you could justify why you needed something, it happened pretty quickly. But in this environment, I was hanging out in the training room, the weight room, the S&C coach's office. Was having these conversations and being around the athletes, and pretty quickly, building those relationships and having an impact because we've kind of removed a lot of the provision. It was just person to person. How can I, help you and teach you, get a better handle of your nutrition? Spent 5 years there. At the time of leaving, we'd worked up to 4 nutrition staff, which was really pretty impressive for a mid-major. We were pretty heavily resourced. But I just felt like it was time for a change, and I love my time there, my position there, but I always wanted to see if an opportunity in professional sport would, present itself, because I don't know, the ego-driven thing, but I wanted to try and measure my effectiveness, or if I could be impactful at that level, at the elite end of working with elite level athletes. And had a couple close calls and interviews for different roles. One day I was driving home from work, and I had an email from an individual at the Mavericks asking if I had any interest in kind of providing some nutrition support and help on a consultancy basis, which I agreed to. And that ultimately pretty quickly materialized into a full-time position. And I just finished my 3rd season with the Mavs. So what was initially a 1-year kind of unpaid venture has now turned into 10 years and a full-on career. And I'd be very surprised if I return back to the UK. Never say never say never, but I imagine my future will be here.
Yeah, I love it, man. Would you mind, before we kind of get into like your nutritional principles and some of the main areas, would you talk about like kind of what your job looks like on a day-to-day basis? I mean, are you traveling with the team? Like, what does that look like for you? So I'm sure a lot of people are listening to this, and if they want to be in the nutrition side, they're like, wow, this sounds amazing. What does the actual job description look like on a day-to-day?
Yeah, good question. Every day probably looks a little bit different. But in general, pretty much leading anything you could relate back to nutrition, within the organization. So we're talking everything from working with individual players to the overall nutrition strategy that we kind of operate as a performance staff, from planning and coordinating a lot of meals. Obviously travel is a huge component of an NBA season. So you're working with hotels, airlines, arenas, different vendors to, ensure the guys have sufficient food available, wherever we may be. Staying on top of, current research and trends that are coming through. Obviously we're dealing with elite level athletes that, are at the cutting edge and, trying to stay ahead of the curve to kind of best educate and resource them. A lot of the provision day to day kind of runs through me. So, there's still an element of, preparation of daily supplementation, recovery shakes, in-game drinks, a lot of, still a hands-on component to the role also. And you had mentioned the travel. Travel just depends on the trip, the duration of the trip, time of year. Playoffs, we just come off a pretty good playoff round, finals round. There was a lot of travel involved there. Just making sure we really had all of our, provision and strategy and making sure everything ran seamlessly, so ultimately our guys could focus on being the athlete and handling business on court instead of having to worry about any external factors. It's right. A lot of different pieces, but I would say those are probably the primary roles there.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason I asked that is I think a lot of times people assume that when you're at those levels, like it's just coaching, right, or just nutrition, like you're just in an office meeting with a player, and there's so much more that goes on behind the scenes. In fact, I did a show with one of our former interns, Eric Huddleston. He's with the Pacers now. And like when he was with the G League, I mean, he's doing everything. I think he was in charge of like booking hotels and giving out hotel keys. I mean, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that the casual observer or fan, just probably wouldn't expect. Like you said, you're back there, talking to hotels and, different people trying to make sure that the food is on point. There's just a lot more to it than probably just the actual act of giving somebody a nutrition program or giving them nutrition advice. There's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes.
Yeah, 100%. I would say a lot of that work and planning is done weeks or sometimes months in advance. And it's pretty long season. So there's always some kind of background logistic work going on. But again, finding the time to carve it out, whether that's pre-game at the arena, the afternoon if we get out early after practice, there's always something to be done. Let's put it that way. Yes.
Okay, so I want to dive in and talk some nutrition stuff here. We talked about this before the show. It's something that I've always been passionate about. Obviously, my wife's a dietitian. So I just want to start really broad, and then we can narrow down. And starting broad, I would just love to hear like your foundation, your big rocks when it comes to nutrition. What are those?
Yeah, I think you could probably break this down to make it pretty simple into the primary foundation for me would be the total, right? We look at total energy intake, especially when dealing with athletes. A lot of times we can get caught up in different types of diets, different principles, getting the perfect macronutrient breakdown. But I think, obviously the bedrock is energy intake. And given the expenditure of an elite athlete is pretty high, given the volumes of training, durations of training, frequent competition, are we at least getting sufficient energy in day to day is a big one. And as we kind of pyramid up from there, we go total and then we go type. And what does those types of foods look like? Obviously here we would pay some closer attention to the macronutrient breakdown. Are you getting sufficient dietary protein based on the energy demands of your sport and your training? Are you getting ample carbohydrates to make sure that we're fueling that sufficiently? Are we getting plenty of good dietary fat in there too? And, is it primarily coming from, whole unprocessed foods? That would kind of be our primary focus. Let's call it, we hear these numbers thrown around fairly often, 80% of the diet coming from whole unprocessed foods and filling the other 20% with what you like. And again, for an athlete with pretty high energy needs, it's pretty hard to achieve those levels of intakes when focusing solely on those whole unprocessed sources. So we've got total type. And then, for me, as we get close to the top of the pyramid, we'd probably consider the timing too. I think for a few years, a lot of the nutrition timing had kind of been pushed aside. We had a few research papers primarily done in resistance trained individuals kind of focused on, physique development and body composition, which maybe, our timing doesn't matter so much. But for an elite level athlete, again, with pretty high energy needs, if you're not paying attention to the timing, you're probably going to fall short of those needs. And again, our primary goal here is performance and protecting performance and supporting recovery. And, the timing does still matter for those athletes. And as we kind of further get up the pyramid, I know we're going to touch on this at some point today, and then we would probably look at, dietary supplements and some of those additional supporting needs, based upon what each individual athlete, requires or what makes sense for them.
Gotcha. So I'm sure everyone listening has heard of the term periodization. But when most of us think of periodization, we're thinking about a hypertrophy phase or a force block or power block. We're thinking more in a traditional training realm versus a nutrition realm. And I know this is something that you're passionate about. So would you mind talking about what nutrition periodization is and how it would apply to helping somebody become a better athlete?
Yeah, 100%. And I think you kind of set it up nicely there when we talk about training periodization. As yourself as a physical preparation coach, you wouldn't train your athlete exactly the same every day, and that's kind of what this idea of the nutrition periodization is born out of. That then why would we expect an athlete to eat exactly the same every single day? We know that adaptations to training can be influenced by nutrition. We know that physical performance could either be amplified or dampened pretty significantly by nutrition. So ultimately looking at aligning one's nutrition based upon their training and competition demands. So to give an example of this, the daily intake for an elite basketball athlete should look pretty different on a game day. Let's say they're playing 25 to 35 minutes, somewhere in that window, as it would probably look the following day where there's maybe a little bit of treatment going on. Maybe they get on court for a little bit. But, there is a fluctuation in demands and the physical need, which is going to be influenced by the nutrition in their intake. So, For example, on that game day, we would probably want to see a higher carbohydrate intake to make sure that we are fueling performance sufficiently. We know a lot of high-intensity activities. We know we are probably going to utilize a little bit more carbohydrate. Now we are the following day when energy needs are pretty suppressed and reduced, more focused upon the recovery and preparation for the subsequent game which is coming, and ultimately the research group out of Liverpool, John Moores, has done a lot of this nutrition periodization research and can pretty simply be deemed as fuel for the work required. And I think that's a pretty simple but understandable way for an athlete to be able to gauge that, and you will quite often see different teams and organizations using like traffic light graphics to maybe enforce the fueling needs for the day. Obviously fueling for again, we'll lean on soccer. Fueling for a match day is going to look pretty different to a training day. 90 minutes which is fully focused upon getting a win and performance. The fueling needs for a technical session on the field for 30 minutes the following day is obviously going to be reduced. So yeah, it's definitely something which has gained, primarily born out of the endurance sports space. I think ultimately where, individuals are really trying to maximize, training adaptations, getting more efficient, utilizing different fuel sources at different exercise intensities. That has kind of made its way over to the team sport space, again, as a way of trying to get athletes to understand the difference between, kind of really fueling for performance. And at the same time, in, elite sport, we obviously have body composition goals, different physical goals to different athletes, and just trying to align what they're doing from a nutrition standpoint with, again, their individual goals or performance goals for that period of time. Yeah.
So I'm curious, how do you go about adherence with that, right? Because I'm just trying to think, like, these are grown adults, right? It's not a college environment, definitely not a high school environment where they may not even be in control of their food. But I mean, what level of control do you guys have over this? I mean, are you providing all of the meals for them? Is this something where you have to like just educate them and then hope that they do these things on their own? Like, how do you go about trying to make sure that, hey, once you've given them these guidelines and these structures, that then they're taking that information and applying it appropriately?
Yeah, I think without getting too much into specifics and how we operate and do it, I think, primarily, yes, there's always going to be education piece. I think adherence is only ever going to be successful if you take the time to educate the athlete on a concept and why you're trying to get them to do it. And then two, trying to align the provisions with that. If we know it's, again, a game day and we're setting up a pregame meal, we want to make sure there's ample carbohydrate options on that pregame meal, things which are, readily digested, easy to absorb, easy on the athlete's gut, but making sure that kind of buffet line or that meal spread, everything from even the placement or the arrangement of the buffet line. You're going to have to go through 4 or 5 carbohydrate options before you arrive at the proteins, right? So just
that's smart.
the small things, aligning the menu, but then even down to, the architecture of the buffet line and the options that are available. And again, probably again on a game day, you will see greater use of things like sports drinks and sports foods, to achieve some of that additional carbohydrate intake. Whereas on a typical training or recovery day, a lot of that stuff is probably not necessary or required. So again, A, the education, and then B, just trying to align the provisions, to make the environment conducive to what you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, no, I love it. I love the psychology of that kind of stuff. Like they talk about, if you go to a supermarket, right? The people that want their things to be purchased will pay extra to be like at eye level, right? You're kind of doing the same psychology, right? Like, hey, here's 4 carbohydrate options before you see the steak or the chicken or anything else. So I love how you're working that. Okay, so one thing that I really want to dive in with you is the idea of achieving the ideal body comp, right? Because regardless of level, whether we're talking about high school, college, the pros, there's definitely an archetype, right? And some guys are a little bit skinnier, some guys are a little bit bigger, but there's also just certain, amounts of body fat, right? Or a certain amount of muscle bulk that you need to be successful. And I actually did an entire module for this for my iFast Basketball Insiders, because I have a lot of high school kids where they're just not physically big and strong enough to play, especially as they go from the high school to the collegiate level. So I would love to hear from you. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen when people are trying to bulk up or add a little bit of muscle?
Yeah, I think we could probably head back to the answer to the first question. And the first one would just be the total, right? Getting sufficient energy intake to help assimilate the growth of new muscle tissue. It's not a particularly easy process. Obviously, again, if you're a novice, you can pretty much do anything and you're probably going to be pretty successful. But without sufficient daily energy intake, it's going to be pretty hard to, kind of really support that physical training to get the outcomes that you want. And, a lot of times, athletes will oversleep, they may skip meals, they may miss a feed. That consistency piece is really important if muscle growth or, adding body weight is a goal, because even just missing one feed for the day with such high energy expenditure, it's pretty hard to make up, and there's only so much you can eat in one sitting. And then you're already behind the 8 ball for the rest of the day. I would say with that, quite often I think it is protein just becomes associated with muscle. And there becomes a hyper focus on, well, if I want to grow muscle tissue, I need more protein. And the diet becomes centered around protein. And while, good in principle, again, a lot of the research shows that, getting sufficient protein, provided, calorie intake is adequate at around that 1.6 grams per kilo, which, for the US listener is somewhere between 0.7, 0.8 grams per pound is sufficient for maximizing muscle growth. And, obviously if we ramp up the protein super high in the diet, typically that's at the expense of other macronutrients. Now for athletes, obviously, if we're in the weight room looking to build muscle tissue and we're leaning on carbohydrate, but a lot of times athletes aren't solely just in the weight room, and whether they're getting on court afterwards, whether they're getting on the practice field, having sufficient energy to be able to fuel their training, but ensure their intake is sufficient to kind of support that muscle growth and achieve a slight positive calorie balance. If you're cutting a load of carbohydrate and fat out of the diet just to ramp up protein intake, you're probably going to be pretty unsuccessful there. And I would say finally that kind of peri-workout period. Again, we touched on it a little bit with the timing. It's amazing to me how many athletes, especially in the college space, would show up, for a training session or a weight room session and not have eaten anything, right?
Yes.
I can go in and hit a 45-minute lift fasted and I'm probably going to be okay, right? But for an athlete to come in, hit a pretty intense lift for an hour and then immediately step out, on court or on the practice field, we're kind of really, missing a big window there where
Absolutely,
again, when we speak about the periodization piece and amplifying any adaptation and performance, we've really missed a big window there. And now even you could have a 3-4 hour period pass where you haven't had any intake of any food, and again, that would lead you all the way back to the energy intake. It's pretty hard to make that up. So making sure that you're fueling sufficiently before training. Again, I know a lot of athletes struggle with that, but it doesn't have to be a substantial meal. Even if we're just taking on board some carbohydrates, a little bit of protein before a session, and then we would make that recovery period a little bit more immediate. Even if we were taking on some liquid calories in the form of a shake, and then following it up that with a meal, pretty soon after. If the goal is to increase lean mass or assimilate some tissue there, really want to be taking advantage of that peri-workout period.
I love it. Yeah, I think one of the things that happens too, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like the longer you do this, the more your own nutritional habits become ingrained. So you just kind of assume, well, everybody eats like this, right? And then you forget about what it's like to be an 18-year-old kid. At least I do, because it's been quite a while since I was 18. But man, going back and doing like some intakes on these kids, and I'm like, hey, let's just start with, why don't you just take some photos of meals so I can see, like what an average meal looks like for you. And, I had one guy who literally it was like a bologna sandwich with like one piece of bologna was a meal. There was another guy where it was literally like fried chicken and a piece of pizza. Like you just really have no clue how these people eat until you start diving in and getting under the hood. And I feel like sometimes that's hard for us, right? Because if you take pride in your nutrition and you want to fuel your body appropriately and take care of your body, you don't remember or maybe realize what it's like to be 17, 18, 19 years old and not understand like, hey, here's how to really properly fuel myself.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of this. And you probably experience this too. I share a house with a dietitian wife, and I think a lot of times you just have assumptions that, even what I would consider the basics that everyone has, in order and line. And I think that's important, for everyone to keep in mind. A lot of times, it's high level collegiate or elite athlete, their diet must be perfect. Not always the case, but definitely a case of trying to meet that individual where they are and, try and make those small tweaks and improvements instead of completely overhauling their diet. So that's a great point.
So one of the things that I'm always interested in, because when people listen to the show, one thing I never want them to feel like is we just talk in theory, right? We're just talking about pie in the sky stuff. So let's say a coach is listening to this, or an athlete, right, is listening to this and they want to add some muscle bulk. What are some boxes they absolutely have to tick if they're serious about adding some lean muscle to their frame?
Yeah, so number one, again, is going to be achieving sufficient energy intake. And I think the easiest way to try and, promote this without an individual tracking their calories or fully tracking their intake would be getting sufficient feeds throughout the day. And I think if we're looking at trying to add some weight or add some muscle mass, we're looking at I would say personally a minimum of 4 feeds, and you could probably go to 5, again, depending on what that intake is for the individual. We spoke about getting sufficient protein, and, again, those 4 feeds kind of align with getting 4 pretty evenly distributed protein feeds across the course of the day. When we look at adding muscle tissue and maximizing protein synthesis, this is where some of the benefits of that timing comes in spreading that intake out over the course of the day to try and maximize the benefits of each feed. Something that I would see a lot, especially in collegiate athletes, would be, minimal protein at breakfast time, maybe sufficient protein at lunchtime, and then probably half or more than half of their day's worth of protein at dinner time, right? The goal is to try and get a little bit better equal distribution throughout the course of the day. And again, especially, I would try and encourage, if time makes sense, a feeding prior to training and a feeding post-training.
Yep.
And where we may look at that 5th feed as an additional feed prior to bed, right? If we're looking at trying to get some additional energy in, and then also an additional protein feed. We do have some research, kind of supporting the recovery of muscle tissue, during sleep, with an additional protein bolus kind of prior to bed, and again, if we're looking at gaining muscle mass, it's a pretty long time period to go without any nutrient intake. If we're having dinner at, say, 7, 8 p.m., and then this athlete may not be eating again until, 8, 9 a.m. the next day. So, that protein feed before bed could be another pretty easy opportunity to achieve that. A lot of people like to recommend a slower digesting protein source. I'm not saying you need to go out and buy a casein protein powder, but, you can add a lot of different things to Greek yogurt and make it pretty tasty, so you can maybe satisfy that sweet tooth and get a nice protein hit prior to bed. Often something which falls under the purview of a nutrition practitioner, although not solely, nutrition, and then would be sleep, right? Getting sufficient sleep each night, really trying to put an emphasis on rest and recovery in those time periods where you can. But again, I can't tell you how many, especially at the collegiate level, how many athletes I've worked with who, think they have all their boxes checked, but, really poor sleep and skipping breakfast would probably be 2 of the primary examples right there. Again, when looking at achieving intake, the sufficient protein feeds throughout the day, and then maximizing that recovery window, sleep is a big one when we're looking at trying to gain some muscle mass.
Sure. I love it. Okay, so 2 follow-ups. The first one of the things that has always interested me is eating before bed, because you'll have some people that are like, absolutely, you need to do it. Others that, it may disturb their sleep, or if they have a big meal. What would be 1 or 2 like good ideas? You mentioned Greek yogurt. What are some meals or food ideas that might work for people that'll give them kind of that extra calorie boost, but wouldn't negatively impact their sleep?
Yeah, for me, personally, if we're focusing on a protein feed, something as simple as a whey protein shake with a little bit of milk, getting a combo of that kind of fast and slow digesting protein. Obviously we mentioned the Greek yogurt. I know cottage cheese probably not as popular with the younger listener. I know it's very trendy right now. People are making different things out of cottage cheese. My wife is always showing me the TikToks and different things. So that would be another good source. And then I think beyond that, would just come down to preference, right? You mentioned a lot of people, do struggle with large meals before sleep, and it does interfere with their sleep quality. We also know that some people do pretty well with high carbohydrate feeds, and have a little bit of research of that to show us supporting sleep quality. So it'd definitely be up to the individual, and I would encourage you trying, some different things. But again, if you are an athlete with pretty high energy needs and the growth is gaining some muscle tissue, looking at having a high carbohydrate feed before bed may be a beneficial strategy if it does not interfere with your training. And again, especially in the collegiate athlete, where we do have a lot of training still in the early morning periods, again, having a high carbohydrate feed prior to bed may be quite favorable for performance outcomes the following morning if they do struggle to eat prior to that session, right? We're at least kind of topping up, filling up muscle glycogen prior to sleep. and loading the muscle, and then if we get a small feed to kind of top off the blood and liver stores in the morning, then we're probably going to be okay for that subsequent session. We're just going to have to put a real emphasis on the recovery at the end. So that's probably how I'd approach it.
I love it. One more. What would you say is a good target goal for mass gain or muscle gain per week?
Oh, good question. Definitely a continuum. We know as we get more advanced, more advanced training, it becomes a little more challenging to add muscle mass as we kind of get closer to our, let's say genetic potential. Yeah. It's a good question. I would say, I like to kind of 0.5% a week of body weight. I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb to ensure that we are at least making some progress, which is meaningful and, noticeable to be able to be tracked, but not at the point where it is too fast where we're just adding additional fat mass, right? We know that we can't really force feed muscle growth. It's not as easy as just eating more food. Again, we've got some pretty good research now showing that the surplus required to support building new muscle tissue is probably not as big as originally once thought or promoted. Even just a calorie surplus of 100 to 200 calories per day does seem sufficient above someone's maintenance, provided the training stimulus is good to support that, where, pretty much historically you've always heard, well, if a pound is 3,500 calories, or we're just going to lump in an extra 500 calories per day. And, it's not a huge amount of difference between having a kind of smaller, more conservative surplus. And again, that will also kind of pay dividends since keeping a positive body composition and not just adding unnecessary fat mass. So obviously that's going to look very different on the level of trainee, what the starting body weight is. If I'm trying to pull a number or figure for you, I like that 0.5%.
I like that. I like that a lot too. And one of the things that I talked about in that module, as a strength coach or as a performance coach, if you're listening to this and you're trying to add muscle mass to your athletes, one of the things that I love to do is have a checks and balances, right? So not just checking body comp, but hey, what performance numbers and metrics can you track? And if they're either at least staying level and or trending upward, that shows you're probably doing things in a positive way, right? Versus if all of a sudden their weight and they look a little bit bloated and then all their performance numbers are going down, that's where you're like, maybe I'm doing this a little bit too quickly. So having that checks and balances, I think, helps.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a great point. We may not be seeing that scale weight changing, right, and corresponding with that 0.5% a week. But if the performance is still good and we're seeing, increases in training loads and, training volume in the weight room, and they're making progress, then maybe they're undergoing some recomposition. Maybe they're adding some muscle tissue and dropping some fat. So again, it's hard to not get too tied up with scale weight and body composition results. Unfortunately, that is the nature of sport.
Yes.
But having some other metrics to be able to lean on and kind of create that full picture of what is going on with the athlete can be really beneficial.
Yeah, I love it, man. So shifting gears, we know fat loss can be quite a bit trickier, right? Because this isn't like a gen pop person that can go and fast and train and do all these things. Like, athletes need fuel to train and compete. So how do you help your athletes kind of walk that tightrope between, hey, we're trying to lean out, but at the same time, we need to have the energy necessary to perform on the court or on the pitch?
Yeah, I think for this one, we can kind of walk back to the periodization concepts here, where we would probably look to get a lot of that carbohydrate intake around training or competition to try and really protect the performance. And then we would look at maybe applying some form of restriction in the period away from that window, right? So let's say we have athlete, college football athlete training in the offseason. A lot of their physical training is in the morning. We're going to probably sandwich that training with some carbohydrate, but as the remainder of the day goes on, we know we can kind of pull back on the caloric intakes of the meals. It's probably a pretty heavy protein feed, plenty of fruits and veggies. The additional carbohydrates, fats that are coming in that meal, probably going to pull back on a little bit. So that way, we're kind of really protecting the training performance and making sure we're getting the most out of those sessions, but we're controlling for calorie intake. And again, you could do this on a daily or a weekly kind of spread. Again, even if primarily we would like athletes to take care of this in the off season, so that once we're in season, we can really focus on the performance. But even if in season, you can kind of really pick out those key sessions or those key performance sessions or competitions where you need to ensure you're appropriately fueled. Maybe that's the day where we bring calorie intake up to make sure we're supporting performance, and then we maybe look at windows in the week where we can pull back a little bit on that intake so that we can still end the week in a net deficit. So I think it makes it a pretty good concept or model to help an athlete, manage that process, but again, still make sure that we are not best protecting performance where we can whilst trying to meet that body composition goal. And then obviously it's the protein feeds, even having those consistent feeds throughout the day is something that I still like. I think it just brings some different structure to the feedings and the meals. Again, we know from some of this more physique body composition type research, the total daily intake of protein is still going to be the most important thing, but I do like having those pulses throughout the day still. Obviously we want to protect muscle mass and lean mass as much as we can during a phase of fat loss where there is going to be some form of restriction applied. And again, kind of the opposite of when an athlete typically would look at gaining mass, where they would try and ramp up their protein intake. A lot of times athletes, when they're going through a period of fat loss, will think, well, I don't need the protein. I'm not trying to quote unquote bulk up or add mass, but having this understanding, again, the protein is protective of muscle, right? And as an athlete, you want to protect as much of your lean mass as possible during a dieting phase, and the goal is to primarily, reduce body fat. So again, that's another big education point. And in addition to that, I think just some of the dietary choices, we're probably ramping up fruit and vegetable intake. We're trying to increase the volume of our meals, make them a little bit more satiating. Some of our food choices may look a little bit different where, we are now putting our primary focus on those kind of whole, unprocessed foods, which we know, bringing along other things to the journey, things like fiber, which is going to help fill us up at mealtime, different micronutrients, again, in a phase of where we are undergoing some form of restriction, but making sure we're getting sufficient, nutrients in through our feeds and kind of really maximizing the value of the foods that we're taking in.
Yeah, I love it, man. Yeah, I kind of think of it as whenever we can address whether it's bulking up or slimming down, whenever we can do those things in the off season, it makes everything so much easier, right? And like kind of the way I describe it to my athletes is, hey, we've kind of got three things that we need to do first. We need to kind of reset your internal environment, right? We need to make sure that you're sleeping and hormones and all that good stuff are operating the way that we want. We need to get your movement back, because we know movement has a tendency to deteriorate over the course of a season, and rightfully so, because you're primed for performance. And then the final piece is that body comp, right? Because it's a lot harder to kind of work these things out as the season is ongoing, because there is such a competitive demand there. So just like coming back to, hey, let's do as much of this in the off season as we can. And like you mentioned fiber, I think one of the simplest things we can do is just like how you eat your food, right? Like you were talking before about the team buffets. All right, well, hey, don't start with, your carbohydrates first. Eat your vegetables first. Then eat your protein. Then eat your carbohydrates last. So just like the sequence in which you're eating your foods can be a really helpful way in helping you kind of like, I don't know, curb your appetite, or just make sure that you're eating more of what you actually need versus, just eating because you're starving and just like dumping extra calories in.
100%. And you also made some great points there beyond just other lifestyle factors, which can be pretty important when we're looking at addressing body composition, right? Getting sufficient sleep. Again, we have pretty good research showing that individuals getting more sleep during, a fat loss phase, primarily losing more fat.
Yeah.
Individuals who are still probably have some suboptimal sleep. Yes, they may be losing weight, but are losing a fair amount of muscle tissue in that time period too. So being able to address sleep, we'd obviously like to see stress come down away from a competitive season as athletes get the time to kind of live a little bit more of a normal schedule and have a little bit more freedom without the stresses of being an athlete, which comes with in-season schedule, and even. You touched on movement, but I even think just movement in general, an athlete can address their knee a little bit in the off season too. You can go out and you can walk and you can do some things outside of just training and competition, because a lot of times, in season when athletes are away from those windows, they don't want to do a whole lot. They want to rest, they want to get off their feet. So again, even the off season makes it a really good time to be able to address some of those other factors, which, again, can improve our dietary adherence and just make it a lot quicker and cleaner process instead of trying to, address that in season where, you do not want to compromise performance.
Yeah, I love it, man. So one thing that we know is that with food, a lot of times there's a lot of emotion tied to food, right? Like things that we like, things that are comfort foods to us. And so that can be a really tricky part of what you do. I don't have to deal with that nearly as much in training. Sometimes guys are like, oh, I love this exercise. Okay, that's not a big deal. But with food, right, especially if somebody is trying to meet these body composition goals, it can be really hard if they're tied up in maybe some foods that aren't great for them. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, one, how do you go about addressing just the psychological side of food? And how do you kind of find that balance between allowing athletes to eat some foods that they love that maybe aren't great for them with helping them just better understand how to fuel their body for maximal performance?
Yeah, I think we've already touched on this a little bit, right? But you speaking about recalls of athletes and, some things which appear pretty obvious to be suboptimal, but just being really careful on how you navigate that, right? That everyone's food choice is a pretty personal thing.
Absolutely.
Everyone eats, so everyone has a pretty strong opinion on nutrition and what is right for them. So I think, first of all, just creating that understanding that within reason, no food is off limits, right? We just know that the amounts and the timing of that food, we maybe need to better align with what you're doing as an athlete, right? If you gave the example of the fried chicken and the pizza, is that a great option to consume prior to a game or prior to a practice? Probably not. We probably know it's not going to be the best session for you. It's probably not going to sit too well on the stomach. It's not optimally fueling, your training for that day. Where if, you're coming off a pretty heavy training week, maybe you're coming off, a competition or a back-to-back, there's maybe an opportunity there to include some of those foods as part of your recovery nutrition without it being detrimental to your training or being, detrimental to your body composition. I think just, again, it comes back to the education and trying to have the athlete understand that these are not off the table, but where can we fit them appropriately over the course of a week to, again, satisfy that desire for them, but still support your training, your physical goals and where you want to be. And I think that's really important because, you could draw up the most perfect plan on paper in the world, but if you're not checking those boxes of likes, preferences, dislikes, the athlete is not going to follow it. And instead of maybe meeting them where they are and trying to build step by step and drip feeding in those changes and information, you're probably going to have a lot more success that way. So, yeah, I think, again, it just comes back down to education, getting an understanding of the athlete, why they like to do these things, and then just working with them to find ways to, maybe optimize that for them. And I think with that, you typically build some trust and adherence. And then over time, the different things they're willing to try and do because you are willing to, be open to some of their concepts and methods, it tends to improve. And as time goes on, you tend to get a little bit closer to where you would like them to be.
Yeah. Well, and look, too, sometimes it's not even just the food, right? It's how it's prepared. There's probably a big difference between a homemade fried chicken, right, with all like fresh ingredients and, things that somebody else has sourced versus going to KFC, right? Or Cane's or, wherever people are enjoying their fried chicken these days. It's like you have to find ways to, again, for me, and what's worked for me with my people is like, hey, look, let's educate them on, hey, this is not a bad food, right? I think that's really important. You illustrated that. Don't make it bad or taboo because that's not going to give you the desired result, but educate them on, hey, look, maybe there's better options. Here are other things that we could do, or maybe it's just, hey, you're going to have this and here's the time to do it. And the other 90% of the time we're locked in and we're doing all these other things that'll still help you ultimately get to your goal.
For sure. And I think, again, as a practitioner and every stop along my career path and being responsible for building out a lot of caterings and a lot of menus, you make an effort to throw your athletes a bone every now and then and maybe pull something out that they weren't quite expecting. Maybe we have a off day on the road during a long road trip and we throw some fun options out there. A lot of these hotels have pretty wide banquet and catering spreads when they send over the packet, and they do some things that, not only fulfills that need or desire for the athlete, but again, you said it's emotional and it's a nice little mood booster and lift instead of, a very performance focused, meal spread.
Yeah. It's the weight room equivalent of arm training. Right? None of these guys want to go in and train legs every day, but you throw them a couple arm workouts and immediately buy-in comes back on board. So got to give them what they want every now and then, right?
Yeah. Again, with a little bit element of control, again, as you mentioned, the preparation piece, the different ingredients that you're using, perhaps the oils that you're cooking it in, the method of preparation, all things which can be tweaked to, again, still be able to check that box for the athlete, but maybe have a little bit better control over, the quality and some of the different nutritional aspects of it.
I love it. Okay, so one last topic I want to touch on here is supplements. Obviously, people still love to talk about supplements. I would love to hear from you as a dietitian and somebody that does this for a living. First and foremost, how do you go about evaluating the efficacy of the supplements that are out there? Because obviously there are a ton. Yeah,
there's a ton, right? And I think primarily it will come back to the individual and just conducting a needs analysis on whether that's based on their goals, whether that's based on some different objective feedback that maybe we're getting through blood biomarkers, trying to really align the supplement with what we're trying to achieve and that outcome. There's a lot of things now that you could argue have some pretty good efficacy behind. We have a pretty limited list of things we know, which are pretty ironclad in the research, and you could go ahead and throw all of these at an athlete, but having an understanding of what they're trying to achieve, what makes sense for their sport and their type of training, potentially what's missing from the diet. Again, this field has always been pretty solid on promoting a food first approach, but I love this concept phrased again by the Liverpool John Moore's research group that it is food first, not food only. The supplements can have a place in trying to make up, some different dietary deficiencies or, getting sufficient creatine or beta alanine from dietary intake alone is pretty much impossible, right? So in some of these scenarios where we know there's a very strong evidence base, for example, creatine for athletes, that is a prime example where supplementing may make sense. Even though we get it from the diet, it's pretty unreasonable to expect an athlete to get an evidence-based dose from food alone. So that would be an example. And another example may be an omega-3 supplement. If an athlete doesn't like fatty fish or doesn't like salmon, chances are they're not getting sufficient intakes of those essential fatty acids. That would be an example where supplementing with it probably makes sense. Because if you have an athlete who doesn't like fish, or maybe you're working with a collegiate athlete that doesn't have the financial resources to go out and buy fresh salmon and cook and prepare that, within their living accommodations, then, there are scenarios where supplements can be really beneficial. But I think, personally as a practitioner, would come down to a needs analysis and really trying to identify what we're trying to achieve with the supplementation, and then to as you mentioned, there's a lot of products on the market, but not every product, is created equally. Looking at if it's reputable brand, trusted manufacturer, and whether that product has third-party batch testing also. We're looking for products which have undergone that testing. There's always going to be an element of risk involved with supplementation, but, the seeking brands that take those steps, at least for me as a practitioner, gives me that peace of mind that I've done my due diligence to, seek brands out that are willing to take those extra steps, and even down to being able to trace batch certificates of different supplementations that they've undergone this testing, past, the different levels of stringency to be on the market, I think is really important, because, you're playing with an athlete's, career at that point, whether it's the collegiate, professional level. A failed drug test can be pretty devastating for an athlete in those environments. So, taking out those extra steps to ensure a level of safety is really important.
Yeah, I love it, man. So you mentioned creatine, you mentioned fish oils. Obviously, those two are kind of staples, and I feel like they're very universally accepted. What are maybe some of your other favorite supplements for hoopers, and why?
Yeah, I think a big one, a pretty common one would be a vitamin D supplement. Again, this is probably something that you would like to have confirmed by blood work, but as a sport, these individuals spend a lot of time inside, don't get much sun exposure, right? It's an indoor sport. Above the collegiate and professional level, once you get into the grind of a season, you pretty much go from practice facility to plane to arena to hotel to plane to you don't see the sun very much, especially during the winter months. So again, that is one which I think is pretty common, and again, one where we would like to have our athletes to have sufficient levels. One where just taking more is not necessarily providing us with any benefit and can actually be detrimental, but having sufficient levels ensures that we are supporting bone health, muscle functioning, muscle remodeling, a number of these different boxes, which are obviously very important for an athlete. But again, probably need to be confirmed, via a blood test, to kind of inform the protocol supplementation. We know caffeine is a popular one, again, kind of tried, tested, and proven in terms of sports performance, and especially when we're looking at, the demands of the sport, a lot of high intensity actions, moving, jumping, again, all pretty consistently supported by the caffeine research to be beneficial. I think being strategic with the timing of it, we all have caffeine. We're probably all guilty of kind of over consuming it. So trying to really save it for key sessions, key performance times, especially given basketball schedule, there's a lot of evening games, trying to make sure we're timing it appropriately where we best, try and protect the quality of sleep where we can.
Yes.
In terms of some others, I personally, I don't always classify this as a supplement. I kind of see it more as a food, but a good quality whey protein supplement, can be a pretty cost-effective way for individuals to make sure that they're meeting their protein requirements. Again, especially when we look at the collegiate level, if I'm, as a practitioner, promoting 4 feeds a day, expecting a collegiate athlete to cook or source 4 whole food meals a day to hit sufficient protein can be pretty challenging. Where quality whey protein, there's hundreds of them on the market now, that a couple scoops of whey can be a really easy, cost-effective way to get a convenient quality source in. And again, I think it was something that we really try to support our collegiate athletes with and have available, make available for them to, again, that kind of pre-bed feed, easy 40, 50 grams of protein via a shake or post-training. It can be a pretty efficient way to help achieve that total daily intake. And beyond that, when it comes to supplements, those are kind of my primary group. I think there can be case by case, again, based on that needs analysis where you do consider some other things. But I think for the most part, those kind of tried and tested and, not even just hoopers. I think most team sport athletes would probably see benefits or value, at least, in those different supplements.
Yeah. Okay. I got to ask one follow-up here. I noticed you didn't mention collagen. I feel like everybody is on the collagen train for like tendon health, joint health. What role, if any, do you feel like collagen plays?
Ooh, good question.
It's hot, right? Like there's a lot of people talking about it. So I'm just interested in your thoughts.
Honestly, it's one I've gone back and forth on as a practitioner. We've got a couple pretty good research studies now done out of a very highly regarded protein lab where kind of got some support for showing collagen not increasing connective tissue synthesis, right? And I think, similar to this concept of, just taking on a load of additional protein is not going to kind of force feed muscle growth. Just taking on a lot of additional collagen doesn't necessarily going to translate to improved connective tissue and tendon health. And that's, I do think a big part of that would come down to the training and loading, again, similar to that assimilation of muscle tissue where, potentially in that environment, maybe some benefits, kind of prior to that loading or around that loading window. But yeah, it is one that I've walked back on a little bit personally as a practitioner. I've really, I only get so many bullets in terms of, trying to push provisions on athletes.
Yes.
And again, if there was a need or, perhaps an athlete returning from a tendon or connective tissue injury, maybe it's one of those that we would slide in there. It is pretty low risk intervention, but I couldn't really at this time, I can't really hang my hat on, being 100% behind it. So yeah, that's my, you may get different answers if you had different practitioner on it, but that's kind of my current standing on the collagen.
No, I love it. And I think one of the things that's interesting, I love to get different viewpoints, right? And everybody has different viewpoints. But one of the things that is really hard, I think, when you work at the highest levels is there's very much, this is not like research, right? Where we have like a control group and like a training group or whatever. However you're divvying it up, like if somebody has a tendon issue, like you're doing everything, right? You're getting medical treatment. You're trying to fix it with nutrition. You're doing the right training things. So it's really hard to discern like, hey, what is one thing doing a bigger or having a bigger impact on the improvement of this tendon health than something else? So that's why I wanted to ask. I'm always interested in, I appreciate your thoughts on that because I'm always interested in what people think. And, I am not following the nutrition research on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And I know you are. So that's good stuff, man.
Yeah, and I think it's something we'll probably continue to see more as time goes on. But yeah, currently, like you said, in an environment and scenario where you're trying to do everything, it is a low-risk intervention that it may have some upside. But in terms of day-to-day provision, and if I only have so many things that I can put in front of an athlete before they tell me to leave them alone, it's right now it's not the first thing on my list, that's for sure. Absolutely. And that's something else people have to understand is when you're working with somebody that intimately, right, you can't ask them to do everything that you would like, right? Like you said, hey, here are my top 3 things. And you feel like if you get 3 for 3, you are winning the day. So 100%. You can't go into numbers 7, 8, 9, and 10. All right, man, big question time. If you could alter the space-time continuum and give young Charles Ashford one piece of advice, what would it be? Great question. I think be patient. I think as an individual, I've always been pretty hungry to learn and grow and develop. And sometimes I think, at least earlier in my career, I caught myself always looking ahead instead of kind of really focusing on where I was at.
Yes.
And, a lot of times, this is kind of cliched. I think if you just kind of focus on doing a good job and where you're at and, taking those steps to improve and, building, especially in the space of sport, building a strong network, doing right by your athletes, kind of bringing your best every day, then everything tends to work out for itself, right? And at least 10 years into being in the US, things have worked out pretty well for me. And I think, sometimes just reminding myself of that and being patient and, making sure, this will sound incredibly cliche, but just enjoying the process, right? Instead of being so focused on the outcome all the time. And I think, initially my desire to, try and cut my teeth at the elite level and work in professional sport, I think sometimes lost sight of the process and kind of what helped get me to that point. And, every now and then have to remind myself that, bring the focus back.
Yeah. Well, it's cliche, but it's also true, right? And I know a lot of people that have gotten that question have said the same thing, and it's no less true in any case, right? And I think it's something you have to learn with time. Like, hey, you can't rush it, right? It's going to happen, but keep putting the work in. Like you said, enjoy the process, right? Like over time, you start to realize, hey, the process is what really changes you as a human, right? It's not just the outcome. It's all the steps that you took to get to that outcome that really are what changed you. So I love it, man. Yeah.
And I think to expand on that, just making the most to enjoy it along those steps of the way. Now I can reflect back on some different moments in my career and be like, wow, that was really cool. But maybe I didn't appreciate it at the time because it was always what's next? What's the next thing? Instead of kind of, not getting complacent, but taking a moment for yourself to be like, okay, that's pretty neat. I've achieved that. What could be the next thing I now look to do instead of just constantly being in the cycle of what's next and where do I go from here?
I love it. Okay, man. Last but not least, we've got our lightning round. So 4 fairly short questions. Okay. Your answers can be as long or short as you like. Number 1, dude, I'm excited to talk about this. Talk to me about quadrant nutrition.
Yeah, great timing. So
literally, I think you just announced it today, right?
Yesterday. So just yesterday. The book is available for pre-release right now. Hopefully it will be in people's hands mid to late September. Really fortunate to collaborate with Daniel Bove on this, kind of long-time NBA performance coach. It's been a great process to work with him. And ultimately, quadrant nutrition is really expanding on a lot of the concepts we've spoken about today. We are taking kind of a periodization system, for team sport athletes and kind of overlaying the nutrition concepts in there. And along the way, there's kind of a deep dive with macronutrients, supplementation, hydration, behavior change. Again, a lot of the things we've touched on today, kind of try and really break down not only the science behind them, but then the application and how people can kind of apply them to their sporting practice. So yeah, really excited about it. It's been a lot of work, but I'm excited to kind of see it come together, and some of the responses I've had the last 24 hours from people, it's neat. People seem excited about it, and I'm excited for people to get it in their hands and read it and hopefully learn from it.
I love it, man. I can't wait to check it out. Yeah, it's funny. I'm smiling because I'm actually remembering I was just going back through Takeoff, which is back there. And I had it last year at Summer League, and I had lunch with Daniel. And I made him autograph the inside, and I made him say, to my favorite private sector strength coach. So that's just reminding me of that. But yes, congratulations, dude. I know it takes an incredible amount of time and effort to pull something like that off. So definitely excited to check that out. And I'll put a link to that in the show notes so people can find it, okay?
Awesome. Thank you.
Of course. Number 2, how was the switch moving from football, American football, to basketball? What was that like for you?
It was a big switch. I would also say that transition from collegiate to professional was probably more daunting, than the switch between sports. I think, we look back on a lot of the things we've spoken about today, the concepts of team sport nutrition actually don't change as much as people may think.
Right.
But, coming to a level where you're really working with and alongside these athletes as opposed to, I think collegiate sometimes kind of fall in the trap of being very, regimented. You must do this. If not, there's consequences. It's pretty hard to do that in a professional environment, right? You kind of really have to strip back and bring that athlete, on the journey with you and really educate them and sell them the value of what you do to get them on board. Whereas in a collegiate environment, there's a lot of steps and structure in place where it's like, you have to do this. You don't really get a choice. That's a little bit different in a professional setting. So big transition. but then also culturally for sports, a change. I'm an Englishman who has spent the majority of his career working in two very predominantly American sports. So, trying to learn the sport still best I can. Obviously a lot of these nutrition concepts are pretty interchangeable between, and that's kind of the beauty of my field and space, that I can have these different experiences because, there is the ability to transition and go from sport to sport. But again, it's been enjoyable. I like that this time of year I don't have to stand outside or work outside. I get to work in an air-conditioned gym, which is nice, especially in Texas.
Yes. Okay, number 3. Whenever I do these, I have to do like a little Instagram stalking. But dude, talk to me about your dog. You have the cutest dog. How long have you had him or her?
So Murphy is about to be 4, I believe.
Oh, yes.
He's awesome.
Murphy's cute.
My wife bombarded me with Instagram posts and stories of golden retrievers for several years before we got married. And, once we got engaged and she moved, up to the DFW area, I said, okay, we can do it. We can get one. I'll be honest, I wasn't, I was indifferent about it. If it made her happy, it's cool. But, man, I can't imagine not having a golden retriever now from here on out. He's awesome. He's a great dog, super friendly, loves people. Regardless of what you've had happen in a day, when you come home and he's fired up to see you, it's cool. It's a good reminder of how precious dogs are, for sure.
Yes, that's so funny. My guy's sitting out here. He's got to sit in his crate. Otherwise, he barks when I do podcasts. But his benefit is, as soon as I'm done, we go out and we play ball and we go for a walk. So that's the trade-off.
There you go.
Yeah, I love it, man.
I had to kick him out beforehand. He was under the desk, so...
I love it. Okay, last but not least, number 4. What's next for Charles Ashford? What are you working on, excited about? I mean, I guess the book's done, so now it's just promoting the book, right, and getting ready for the season?
Yeah. Again, trying to practice what I'm preaching and be focused on now. We have the season upcoming. I'm excited about this year. There's some things, personally I want to improve upon and, hopefully enhance player experience in my role, and again, kind of continue to drive the value and impact of nutrition. But we still have a few weeks. So actually on Sunday, my wife and I are off to Europe for a couple of weeks, little vacation time. And then one of my closest childhood friends is getting married in a couple of weeks' time. So getting head home, see family for a bit, and be able to go to the wedding. So important to take some time to recharge. We are coming to the back end of the off season, but it's been a busy one. And then obviously, we're getting the book finalized during this time period too. So ready to take a couple of weeks to recharge and then kind of hit the ground running, and hopefully a successful season. And let's see if we can go one step further this year.
I love it, man. Well, Charles, it's been amazing chatting with you today. Thank you so much for your time. Would you just finalize and just tell everybody a little bit about where they can find you?
Yeah, I would say best place is probably LinkedIn. Obviously, if you just punch my name into LinkedIn, you probably find me on there. Always try and answer any questions, get back to people, try and be something that I take pride in, and try and get back to the field and other individuals if they have questions and want to reach out. Not as active on other social media platforms. So, I would say probably LinkedIn is the best place if you're trying to get in contact.
But great dog photos on IG. In your defense, great dog photos. So
100%. A little more, not as much nutrition content on there.
Hey,
but plenty of dog pictures.
That's right. Hey, there's nothing wrong with the dog photos. Well, again, Charles, really appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, Mike. Thank you.